Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Today, we are going to explore the role of parents and parenting, as you have seen in the invite, in early childhood development. Now, this is a very important topic, as I think we all understand that the healthy development in the early years provides the building blocks for the children's educational achievement, economic productivity, their lifelong health, and even building strong communities. What we do as parents and as carers during this incredibly important period ensures that the children have a strong foundation for future development. We have two experts to discuss this and explore these topics with us. We have Jan Dubiel. He's one of the most influential persons in British education and early childhood in the UK. Jan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Jan Dubiel. I'm currently Director of Early Years at Harrow AISL Schools based in Southeast Asia. I've had over 30 years experience working in early childhood as a teacher, as a manager, a leader. I worked with government on education policy, particularly around assessment. I worked independently. I've worked all around the world. I'm also a parent and a grandparent, and I like to think my view of early childhood is multidimensional and multi-perspective. So very excited about the work that I've been doing around this area, and particularly in identifying the importance of the role of parents and how that sits alongside what is kindergarten experience or early child experience, maintained experience. And how those two things fit together, and as we'll, I'm sure, explore as part of the seminar, what we know about learning and development is increasing rapidly, and one of the things we continually come back to is about the role of parents as being absolutely central to that. And so this is a very, very exciting project and a very exciting place to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan. We also have Rishu Srivastav. She's the founder of Tillid and Neuspurt, and I understand that she has a vision of empowering lives by bringing trusted care to all. Rishu, can you share a bit about your background and your entrepreneurial journey?
Thanks, Iram. So my name is Rishu. I come from a technology background. I was working for an IT company for 15 years before I had my daughter Kiara, who was born last year in Jan. And when Kiara was born, a lot of things changed for me because, I mean, with multiple things, right? With a new child and the pandemic, things were different. And when because of the pandemic, when we were looking for a child carer, we realized it's not that easy. And what is it that you need to look for in a carer? So that is where we started Tillid. And the other bit that got me interested with Kiara was the earlier development. And that's basically, again, with the pandemic, you have a lot of time at hand and you just land up reading a little more. So we started off with Neuspurt, which is focused on earlier development.
Right. Thank you so much, Rishu. And just for everyone who's joining in, I understand that Beth is keeping a little bit unwell, so she sends her apologies. And I truly hope that she can join one of our future conversations. Meanwhile, I do wish her a very speedy recovery. Now, before we dive in, some housekeeping points first. We'll be running a few polls in between to keep the discussion engaging and so that you can also, as participants, engage in what we are talking about. Second point is we'd love to hear from you. So please type in your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll try to pick up as many of them as we have the time for those. And lastly, I want to say that a recording of this webinar will be made available for everyone. We'll send an email and you can watch it and share it with anyone who's not able to attend and things like that. Jan, let's just dive in, right? Let's get straight into it. Could you explain the idea of early years in a bit more detail? And why is this critical in a child's growth? And one final question or a sub question, is there any scientific basis for whatever you're going to say?
Yeah, it's a very, very open and multifaceted question. Yes, the recognition of the importance of early childhood development relatively recent in terms of thinking, and particularly in terms of the science and the research behind it. To kind of answer your last bit of the question first, there is a phenomenal amount of research, both in terms of studies, in terms of comparative studies, longitudinal studies, but particularly around neuroscience, which pinpoint the specific importance of early childhood development. And although this research obviously is growing, and there are different schools of thought, and there's obviously, as in any discipline, there's a lot of dialogue, there is certainly a consensus that the period from birth, or actually pre-birth till 7, around about the age of 7, is the most significant single period in any person's development. In terms of neurological growth, it's most phenomenal and rapid that happens throughout your life. In terms of your enculturation, what you understand about your sense of self, your sense of identity, what you understand around the world around you, how you relate to people, how you interact with people, all those elements crystallize and grow from a very early, very small start in those first 7 years. And what we know from early years is the kinds of experiences that children have, the way that they're shaped, the way that they're delivered, the way the children engage with them, can have a highly significant impact on their long-term development. Not just academic, though that is critical, obviously, and highly influenced by it, but also social, emotional, psychological, cultural, and so on. So when we work with very young children, or we are the parents of young children, we have this immense responsibility to optimize and shape what that child will become. There is a saying, give me a child until they're 7 and I will give you the adult. And that's just quite an old saying, which is reflected in many, many different cultures, so that you wonder there's some truth around it. And what we know now is, certainly from neuroscience particularly, that is absolutely true. So it's not just, it's a period of growth, and we should acknowledge that. I think what's happened perhaps more recently is we are skillfully and carefully, in a measured way, saying, if we do this, then this is more likely to be successful. If we don't do that, then the child is more likely to grow and thrive in different ways. So we are starting to get this sense of what we can do and how we can optimize this massively significant period of time.
Right. That's wonderful. I think what I'm hearing is that if we want to shape how a child grows into an adult, and therefore by extension how the future of the world looks like, we cannot ignore the role of parents in the time between 0 to 6 years. So that's quite insightful and deep as well. But coming quickly to you, Rishu, can you speak a little bit about Neuspurt and what got you interested in the topic of early years development?
So when Kiara was born, I think she was about 3 months old, which is when the pandemic hit. And in the UK, you have what's called the health visitors. They do visit your home to assess the development of a child. So before the pandemic, when they were coming in, they would just ask some basic questions, and they would take the physical measurements to see if the development is fine. And at that point, I wasn't quite aware of early years. But when the pandemic hit in, all of this started coming in as surveys. And when you look at the surveys, there were a lot of other sections other than just the physical development. So that got me interested, because that is when I realized that there is more to earlier development than just your nutritional aspects and the physical development of it. So which is when I started reading a lot about early years and realized, that the brain development plays a big role in the first 6 years of a child's life. So you have what's called the growth spurts in a child's life, which is where the physical developments happen, and the wonder leaps, as they call it, where the mental development happens. So we started off with Neuspurt, which is the neurological development.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd just like to put it on record that thanks to Kiara, we have an entrepreneur kickstarting her journey. So thank you, Kiara. Now, I'm going to sort of introduce us to our first couple of poll questions. It should be up on your screen in a bit. There we go. The first question is, how many nerve cells are there in a human brain?
Sorry, bit of a glitch. You should
There
see
we
it
go.
now.
Yeah. How many nerve cells are there in a human brain? And the second question is, what percent of lifetime neurological connections happen before a child is 7 years old? Pallavi saying
Can't see
she
the
can't see the
questions.
questions. Is that true for everybody, or are others able to see it? Because I can,
Yeah,
but
I'm
obviously I can't
getting people poll in, so I
responses.
think they are able to see it.
Okay, okay. There we go. Questions are visible. So fair enough. Thank you. Just another 10 seconds more before we kind of see what the results are saying. Right. Can we have the results? That is a very interesting spread of responses. About 40% are saying that over 86 billion nerve cells are being made in the human brain, are there in the human brain. And a majority of the responses, which is 46%, say 70 to 85% of the neurological connections happen before a child is 7 years old. Jan, as the expert, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So I think, in the first question, you get a sense of the enormity of that potential. So the 86 figure is I mean, we are dealing in inexact science to an extent. You get a sense of the potentiality of the human brain. So we're born with our nerve cells there, and what happens as we learn and develop and grow is we utilize them and we make sense of them, and that's something we talk about in some deal. But it gives you a sense of the almost infinite potentiality of the human brain. In terms of the second question, it's worth sort of clarifying that. Yes, it is a very high figure in terms of what happens before a child is 7 years old. And I think it comes back to your very first question about why is early years so significant? Because in that period of time, we make this massive percentage of our lifetime neurological connections. So we go from a fetus to around about the age of 7. It's not fixed in any way. And in that time, the period of growth and the period of internerve and synaptic connection is phenomenal, because experiences are so new, because new things are happening, and a child's biologically programmed to make sense of them and utilize them. In England, the framework for the early years is called the foundation stage, early years foundation stage, and the choice of the word foundation is very significant, because those initial connections that happen in those first 7 years lay the framework on which later knowledge is based and then later knowledge is built. So although that figure is massive, it still doesn't account for the huge amount of learning which happens post 7. But that learning connects to these frameworks and that have been established at that point. So it very much the debate or the narrative in early years is to say, well, how do we establish the most effective framework? How do we establish the best foundations that a building is built on? And that's where a lot of the science comes in, because often the temptation has been, certainly very much in the past, that we do with young children the same that we do with old children, but it's a bit easier. And actually we know it's quite significantly different. It's much more experiential, it's much more based around language, and it's very much based around the concrete. So those foundations about concrete, real experiences, which then enable you to form abstract ideas and knowledge. I'll give you one quick example. So a child playing in the water gets a sense of, a very young child gets a sense of water, gets a sense of its fluidity, it being hot and being cold. Those are direct multisensory experiences. That lays the foundation of the waterness of water, if you like. Water is a familiar resource, familiar material, and they have an experience of it. As they get older, they learn facts and knowledge about water, about its use, about its chemical construction, and so on. All of that relates to that experience of understanding what water is, that connects the concrete to the abstract. And that's one of the fundamental key elements of how good early years learning and development happens.
Right, wonderful. Now I'm going to dig a bit deeper there, Jan, if that's okay. We have a lot of people dialed in today, and obviously a lot of other, who couldn't join will see a recording of this later on. And they're likely to have children across the age group of 0 to 6 or 0 to 7 years. And you said, the early years phase starts pre-birth. So you could have prospective parents as well being interested in this topic. Now, how much of what we are discussing today is relevant to all of them, for instance? And are there any kind of nuances or differences that we need to be mindful of?
That's a very, very good question. I mean, we talk about early childhood as a phase, which starts certainly from birth, possibly pre-birth. Perhaps talk about that in a minute. And the reason we talk about birth to 7 is because round about the age of 7, the brain goes through this process called myelination. And what happens in that period of time is the brain looks at all the connections that have been made, and it prunes, it gets rid of connections that are weak, and it strengthens connections that are strong. So the weak connections, the flimsy connections that the child doesn't use very much, are got rid of to make way for this strengthening. And myelin is the sort of chemical that goes around it. Now, this is the point where, as I've just been describing, the concrete can become abstract. I mean, I'm talking in very general terms, obviously, and it's again, some of it's tested and so on. But generally speaking, round about the age of 7, children move from early childhood to middle childhood. And one of the things that's significant is, as this process takes place around about the age of 7, children are much more able to talk about abstract ideas. Of course they can beforehand, but it becomes much more significant, which is why in most countries in the world, formal schooling starts at 6 or 7. Because even when people didn't know about the neuroscience that we know now, there was something about children at around that age to do with their maturity, to their development, which changed significantly. And so that's why in the kindergarten phase, which is the most universal phase, it runs up to the age of 6 or 7, then children transfer to main school. So we talk about that as a phase, but your question is a very astute and correct one. That within that there is significant period of growth and change within that. If you think of a 6 or 7 year old and you think of a newborn baby, the comparison is a very stark one.
Right.
So what we're talking. Sorry, to finish the last sentence. Sorry, no. So what we're talking about is a phase, but it's a phase which has a very clear developmental path within it. And by understanding the basis of how that learning and development works, we're able to adjust that to the development of the child as they become more secure, stronger, more articulate, more able to understand.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. But I'm going to stick with you, Jan, and I promise I'm not picking on you. So, what you talked about seems for a person who's not an academician or a researcher, seems quite technical and dense. Is there any way, all of this, topics and concepts, can they be simplified so that more and more parents can learn from it and implement it in their kind of day-to-day parenting sort of activities, so to speak?
I mean, absolutely. I would describe myself as a pracademic, a practical academic. I'm not an academic in the sense I don't work for university. I'm not a clinical researcher, so I'm an educator and a parent, someone who worked on the front line with teaching very young children, which I was a kindergarten teacher for many years. So I think the research is really important, and it's really important to understand both the clinical, quantitative and qualitative research. But I think part of the important role is to interpret that to make so that people can do exactly what you said, to make sense of it, to be able to use it practically. So the example I gave you about water is perhaps one we could stick with. We understand that the process of learning about water and the nature of water, the use of water, and so on, is a complex process and critically important. But by knowing from neuroscience that by giving children experiences, we start that process is really valuable. I'm moving on from that a little bit, though, in the same realm. One of the examples I often talk about is we talk about everyday activities and the importance of using everyday activities and seeing the learning potential within them, or the developmental potential within them. So for example, when you're hanging clothes out to dry, you're undertaking a scientific act. So when you put the clothes out on the line, they're soaking wet, and then sometime later you touch them, they're absolutely dry. How has that happened? How has that happened? Well, we know from our science that that's to do with evaporation, the effect of heat on atoms, which changes liquids to gases and so on.
Sure.
But giving the child that experience and talking about things getting wet and dry, you're laying the foundations of that. So I think what we can do, and what's I think really exciting, is we can sort of filter down, draw down all this research and knowledge, but actually turn that into very real, direct, practical things that parents can do with children. And many of them are about everyday things. They're about preparing food together. They're about doing the washing. They're about going for a walk. They're about watching birds fly in the sky, or watching cloud formations and so on. But with the knowledge underneath it, particularly the knowledge of how that works, it crystallizes that into something much more significant. Einstein once said, "Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler." So I believe we should all, I think everyone in the world should have a basic understanding of how the brain works and the basic principles of neuroscience. Because understanding the processes and the elements of that gives us an insight into why we're doing what we're doing. For me, that's really critical. It's not just saying, help your child put some clothes on the line, full stop. That's an activity. We have to know why that's significant and what questions, what nuances you can tease out to that, which will strengthen the connections they make. Because if you ask the right questions, or you give them the right information, or you have the right conversation with them, they will make hundreds and thousands of neurological connections in that second that you're doing that activity. And I think that's the point where we can optimize all that new information and new knowledge.
Fantastic. Sounded a bit like a movie there, talking about all the million, connections happening in a matter of second and things like that. But I'll let that moment pass. Rishi, coming to you, you're a new parent, right? So what are your thoughts on learning about parenting in the scientific manner that Jan is describing, as opposed to perhaps a little bit more traditional way of learning, through sort of self-acquiring the knowledge on internet, or talking to older people in the family, or through peers? Like, what's your experience been as a parent?
It's been a great learning, is what I would say. And it's basically because I remember, as you know, I come from India, right? And we have a lot of influence from various sectors of life. You'll have people from family members or friends who are going to constantly advise you on things. And then there are certain norms that have been set in by the society in terms of how the parents should be, how moms should be. So there are a lot of stereotypes like that. And since I've been in the UK for long, what I realize is things here are slightly different. You don't have that much of a societal pressure, but you're still judged as a mom, I would say, rather than a new parent, right? Because a lot of responsibility is often put on the mother, that the moms are meant to be doing certain things. So when I got interested in earlier development, I realized that it is not just the role of a mom. The child is for both the parents. So they need to be doing things together. But at the same time, here I was a part of what's called the NCT group. And NCT group basically, as there's a group of few parents who are expecting children at the same time. So that was a group I was a part of. And there were a lot of such people who had babies perhaps within a span of a month. So we were parents together. And there was a lot of pressure that comes from there as well, because people are discussing different things. What are the different classes that is going around? Should I be taking my kid to a music lesson or to sensory classes? And that landed up putting a lot of pressure as a first-time parent, because I was constantly questioning myself that, Kiara is just back then about 6 months old. Do I really need to push her to do such things? And taking her to classes is a lot of pressure for the parent as well. I mean, for me, it was a lot of pressure because I had to work things around her nap time. And obviously, all classes don't work as per your schedule because each child is different.
Sure.
So we could not plan things. So what I landed up doing with Kiara was getting her involved, like Jan was saying, in day-to-day chores. And that itself was, good because it made life easy for me. I didn't have to like pressurize myself in doing certain things. But I think it was a lot of learning for her as well. Like when I do my cooking, she is often sitting with me to put in all the spices in the food. And now all my food is messed up because I don't know how much salt she's putting. That is her job. She has to put salt in every dish that I make. And
Right.
she doesn't know the measures. So she'll keep looking at me and I don't know what the right measure is, right? Because I do it with my instincts. So I think things like that has, in fact, given her a lot of experience because now she knows what the different types of spices are. Its texture, its colors, and I think those are the kind of things that are interesting for her. So what happened in due course, because I understood the basics of early years, I realized it's not really important to push yourself or the child to get into classes and acquire those skills. So
Right.
if you engage them in day-to-day experiences and activities, that's good enough. And that's also eased off a lot of pressure from me as a parent.
Sure. Sure. That's, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing something that's quite personal to you. So thank you for sharing that. And secondly, I think that whole sort of pressure point that you're talking about, Rishu, is quite important because there are two. The child obviously is under pressure if you're putting them in multiple classes and multiple, activities, and they're moving from A to B to C, and they don't have the time. And what I'm hearing is that you don't need to put the child through that much duress. You can have the same kind of learning and growth by involving them in day-to-day activities. The second thing that I'm hearing is it also reduces the pressures for you as a parent who's already being stretched in different directions with your professional responsibilities and your household chores, and then now you have a child to take care of as well. So in a way, if you just learn a little bit about the fundamentals of the basics of how you can help the child grow and develop, it seems you're making the lives easy for yourself and for the child. So that's kind of quite an interesting takeaway there. Now I'm going to put Rishu you in a bit of a spot and ask you a little bit of a serious question. I'm guessing when you were going through your pregnancy and immediately after birth, you might have done some reading on this topic. So do you have any thoughts on autism spectrum disorders, and whether you have any thoughts on how perhaps parents with children who have some developmental disabilities, how they can go about managing their role?
Yeah, I think there when I was doing the reading, and this is just research based, Saram, because I'm no expert in the field, what I understand is in these areas, if there are developmental issues, early intervention and how you deal with a child perhaps does help quite a bit. And there's a lot of research on that. And there are early signs that the child would give on, whether there are problems or not. And what I mean by that is you have different milestones. So for example, if there is a speech disorder, you would know if the child needs to go and see a therapist based on what the milestones are. I'm not suggesting that people panic in 6 months time, because obviously you're not expecting a 6-month-old to talk. But then parents, if they are watching out for signs, they will be able to figure out whether the milestones are being hit, and when they need to go and see the therapists or experts in the field.
Right. And Jan, coming to you, and staying on the same topic of developmental disabilities in children, I was reading a recent article which says that babies, who have perhaps autistic tendencies, often try and communicate in a manner that's slightly different to how other babies would communicate. There's perhaps reduced eye contact, for instance. Now the question that comes to mind is, obviously experts can understand and respond to it in a particular manner because they're trained to do so. but can parents be coached to respond better to such different forms of communication in babies and children?
So, again, that's a very good question. I think one thing to say very early on is that, and I'm hesitating to even use the word, but I will do, so bear with me. But typical child development is a very, very extended bell curve. So although, yes, we do have milestones in child development, they are very broad and very interpretable. And I think one thing to say very early on is that children can be anywhere within that bell curve and still be quite typical. And it's again, we're back to the brain. The way that the brain works is a result of your environment. It's a result of your inherited genes. It's a result of diet. There's a whole multitude of factors which help that. So some children, for instance, learn to talk very, very early on. Some children might learn much later on. It's still within typical development. Some children miss out developmental milestones altogether. My daughter, who's now 22 as an example, my daughter never learned to crawl. She never crawled. She sat up and then she did this bottom shuffling thing, and she could move at this incredible pace doing this bottom shuffling thing. It's absolutely amazing to watch. It was quicker than crawling. So actually, in her mind, there was no point crawling because that would slow her down. So she could stand and then she could get up straight away. So there are all these little idiosyncrasies in child development which we have to acknowledge, and I think we have to embrace this broad bell curve of what is typical. So, but to go back to your question around special educational needs and disabilities, absolutely. I think there are ways of responding and interacting and understanding how you work with children who are in some way perhaps outside that typical bell curve. And again, I would stress, being outside the bell curve in one area doesn't mean you're outside the bell curve in another. So it's about being very clear about the special nature of the support and interaction that needs to take place. And also within this broad understanding that all children are unique. All children have different ways. You know, my example I gave my daughter is one. So it's in being able to embrace that. But there are occasions, and you're absolutely right, where you would need that specialist advice. And something like the autistic spectrum disorder has a lot of research around it, which will both support parents in understanding it, but also providing them with techniques, strategies, and approaches that will further enhance and understand the life of the child development.
Right. There's a lot to digest then. You know, perhaps it warrants its own conversation,
Yes.
but one for future. Now, I think it's time for our next poll question. It's gonna come up on your screen in a bit. The question is, what in your opinion is the percentage of women in India especially who abort their careers midway due to caring responsibilities? So what percentage of women in India abort their careers midway due to caring responsibilities? And yeah, we'll keep the poll open for about 20 seconds. You know, irrespective of what the right answer is, I think we know that this is a significant number and one we should be, you know, thinking about in a serious manner. There we go, the results. So at least, well, almost 86% believe it's more than 40%, which is quite compelling. The right answer will be shared in the chat. But question for you, Rishu, there. You're a new parent and you're a career woman. You had a job before, and now you have a couple of startups. What is your advice to parents who are trying to balance their professional responsibilities and parenting responsibilities?
I think, first of all, we shouldn't be putting a lot of pressure on ourselves because one, the anxieties do get passed on. So, you know, if you are an anxious parent, you're likely to have an anxious child. So it is important to not pressure yourself and make things enjoyable. But for me, with a startup, it is a lot of time that goes on the work itself. So I have to be mindful that I spend whatever time I have as a quality time with Kiara. So
Mhm.
I wouldn't have the entire day to spend with her, but if I've got those 4 hours, she gets all the attention. So I would, I mean, what I've done is I've created these compartments. I've compartmentalized things, and when
Mhm.
I'm at work, she is with her nanny. And when I finish my work, I'm with her. I'm not using my phone. I'm not using my laptop. The bit that's there though is if she sees me with the phone, she wants the phone, right? So we do tend to create those boundaries, and that is what I would suggest as well. Whatever
Mhm.
time you have with the child, give 100% rather than get your work into the personal life and in space where your child is seeking attention. But at the
Right.
same time, what I've also seen, Sairam, is in the UK, and I think it's happening in India as well. Corporates are offering a lot of support to young parents,
Mhm.
and if there is any help that parents need, they should go and talk to their employers, because the employers can often provide access to consultants. Like, if it's a mom who is who's breastfeeding, they could be consultants like lactation consultants. They could get access to, or you could get access to pediatricians or experts in different fields. And
Yeah.
corporates have tie-ups with such people, but at the
Mhm.
same time, it could be that they could provide counseling or sessions for young
Mhm.
parents. So I would suggest that if parents need help from
Mhm.
their employers, they should go and ask for it.
Right. Right. Thank you so much. And Jan, same question to you. What would be your advice to parents who are kind of attending this event, or perhaps might see a recording of this in the future, especially if somebody got excited or curious following what we've discussed so far, and wants to dig a bit deeper, learn a bit more about how they can be better parents or how they can help the child grow and develop better. So any steer in that direction, please.
Well, I think Enrico articulated it really wonderfully. That there is, I think, at the centre to this. So there are two things really. One is the importance, understanding the importance of the role of parents. What you do is you might not be a qualified teacher, but you are
Mhm.
teaching a child. You're a child's first most enduring educator. And second, that the notion of quality, the notion of quality time and quality
Mhm.
interactions. And again,
Mhm.
as Rishi said, having that time where that interaction is at its best and
Mhm.
it's most powerful. Two of the things we know very clearly about learning is the primacy of what we call reciprocity, which is the interaction between adult and child, and the warmth and sincerity and authenticity of that. And second is the role of language. Language is critical. Language development isn't just about communicating. All our thoughts, our memories, our knowledges, our thinking all resides within the vehicle of language. So the stronger our language in terms of both vocabulary, but also the protocols of language, understand what we sometimes call serve and return, the notion of dialogue, how
Mhm.
you use different language in different contexts, in different ways, or for different people. That enculturation about language and the vocabulary that goes alongside it is vital. So whatever
Mhm.
you're doing with the child, it's about having talking with them, listening to them, but also talking with them, modeling how to talk, modeling how to share language, but also listening to them and giving them time to respond to questions and to responses that they make. For very young children, for us as adults, we speak as we think. It's a simultaneous process.
Mhm.
For children, they have to think, find the word, and then communicate the word. And although that process is, microseconds, it takes longer. So one of the things we need to do as adults is listen to children and give them time to respond.
Right.
So the kind of slightly bigger answer to the question is, before I took on this role, I was involved in developing these materials for parents
Mhm.
to shape, I think, a lot of the things we've talked about, a lot of things today, and a lot of really good ideas and a lot of perceptions, both from as parents, as educators, and sometimes that information can be very overwhelming. And with technology, you can find out pretty much anything you want about parenting and have 100 different views of exactly the same thing in an instant. So one of the things that I've found, working certainly internationally and working with parents, which I have done, is within that there needs to be some kind of, it's helpful if there's some kind of structure. So we provided these materials in the role of modules and in the role of almost as a qualification, where they go through accumulating information, knowledge about different elements of child development, how you apply that and how you make sense of that and reflect on it and use it in your everyday. And we've talked about very simple examples. We've both talked about cooking, and we both talked about hanging out, washing, and so on. How do you and in those situations, how do you ensure that the quality of that time, because as parents, and I was a working parent as well, excuse me, you have these windows of time, you have these elements of time, and it's how do you optimize that? How do you make sure they are of the highest quality, because actually they will make the strongest and most powerful neurological connections. So I would say there is a structure around that which I think helps guide all that information. It also helps, and actually Rishi said that, which is talking about cooking, about that being instinctive. Much of what we do as parents is instinctive. It's both biological, but it's also we draw from sometimes the way we've parented or been parented, or we've seen people parenting.
Sure.
Sometimes it's it's flipping that, it's subverting that, and in some cases we want to parent in the way we weren't parented. And often it's a mixture of lots of those different things.
Yeah.
So I think by providing a shape to that, it gives us a sense of making sense of it and then being as effective and as informed as possible.
Sure. No, thank you. And Jan, you mentioned language a few times when you were explaining all of that. Presumably, my understanding is that language need not be English per se. It could be any language that the household or the parents speak. It's the concept of language as opposed to any particular language in particular. Is that the right assumption?
Oh, absolutely, 1,000,000%, absolutely. Interesting enough, I work in where I work in Southeast Asia. We run bilingual kindergartens, and the second language is English. So children come in speaking the local language, sometimes Thai, sometimes Mandarin, Cantonese, and so on. And as part of the process, which is research driven, is to say, actually, before you introduce a second language to a child in that kind of context, they have to be secure in the framework, the architecture, the brain architecture of language. So the focus is very much about their home language. That's quite different, though, if children grow up in a bilingual family where both parents speak different languages. Actually, what happens to those children is they grow up learning those languages in parallel. And we used to think, two languages at the same time is too difficult for young children. Actually, it's the opposite. The more they're exposed to those different languages, the more they pick up on both of them simultaneously. And some of the research and examples that are really interesting. Some children, for example, they will speak, they will mix their two languages together. Where they don't know the word in one language, they'll just put in the word for the other language. And sometimes it takes a while for them to actually realise they're speaking two different languages.
Yeah.
So yes, language is crucially important. Bilingualism, multilingualism, we also know from research, has massive benefits on neurological growth. And actually, the more languages you learn, the more languages you pick up as you get older. So in the sort of global international community that we live in the shrinking world, where the world is a village, actually understanding that concept of bilingualism is really important.
Right, fantastic. As you were speaking, mixing of two different languages, there's a concept in Delhi called Hinglish, which is the marriage of Hindi and English, and it can, it's perfectly natural for anyone who's grown up in Delhi, but for anyone else, it can be a bit of a nightmare traversing that language. But anywho, moving on to a more serious sort of conversation that we're having. I think that brings us to kind of the end of the main part of our conversation. We've had a lot of questions coming in, but before we dive into the question and answer session or section, There's one more poll that I like to push out, which is just to understand from everyone who's attending, what next for you from here? You're here, you're taking the time out to understand the role of parents, but what is the next step in your mind, or in your thinking? I'll just put that question out there for about 30 seconds, and then we'll see what everyone's thinking. Meanwhile, I must warn you, Jan and Rishu, that there's some very tricky questions that have come up. So be warned.
So the results of this, we wouldn't be sharing because this is only for our reference.
Okay, that's helpful to know, Rishu. So are we good to then move on to the question and answer section?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. So just to kind of maintain the flow of the conversation, Jan, you mentioned the qualification, right? Now, one question that's come up, and I think it's a fair one, is you mentioned South Asia, you mentioned UK, but how relevant is that qualification to India and Indian parenting styles?
Well, again, very good question. As I've said, I've worked around the world, and one thing that's always been a particular interest to me is how do we find the universality of child development and in education, but also in parenting. So the qualification has been written as a universal qualification. And because it's based on the science and it's based on what we know about neuroscience, child development, everything in there is relevant to any culture. Of course, there are cultural implications when we talk about different foods, or we talk about different clothes, we talk about different contexts and familial contexts and children. And of course, that's very different. But the fundamental truths, if you like, about what works for very young children, what young children need, and how to optimize that are transferable, absolutely. And this was the qualification was written for an international audience. It was written to appeal to any culture in any country, and it's not specific to any particular community or culture.
Fantastic, thanks, Jan. Again, just keeping the flow going. Jan, you spoke about different contexts and different kind of local influences that can influence how parenting works in different societies. This is a question for Rishu. Rishu, you grew up in India, so space is a big constraint, especially for professionals who are growing up, or rather are living in apartments. So the question is that public spaces are far and few in cities, unlike what now you might be experiencing in the UK. So can the activities that you're mentioning or you're thinking about doing, can those be tailored to such circumstances?
Yes, Sairam. So when Kiara was born, we were stuck in India for 4 months because of the pandemic, right? And I do understand what you're saying, that space is a constraint. But what we also have to be mindful of is a lot of these things that we're talking about, activities, is day-to-day chores.
Right.
Where you're getting your kids involved. Or it could be like, a lot of people nowadays live in these high-rise societies, and you take the child out for a walk, and you're just explaining things like, making the child walk on the grass, or looking at the clouds, or touching the leaves, all those kind of things. And that is something which is very normal. So I don't think space really matters. But at the same time, we are also talking about activities like one of the things that we did in the UK is Carrie used to go for what's called the messy play, where you actually encourage the child to get messy. So I think that's kind of a taboo, because a lot of families would think that, why would you want the child to get messy? But I think it is just exploring textures and stuff like that. So if parents are open to dealing with the after cleaning that happens after all the mess is created, yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. And Jan, would you agree in terms of the activities perhaps that you might have discussed or included in the qualification that you mentioned? Would you agree that space is not a constraint?
No, absolutely. I'll answer that in a minute. I just want to say that messy play and that immersion in material, the multi-sensory experience of that is an incredibly powerful way of learning. And as adults, maybe we find that children getting dirt, getting different materials, feeling them between their skin. When you're doing that, they are making hundreds and thousands of neurological connections. So it's a really immersion and experience is really powerful. No, I would absolutely echo what Rishi said. I don't think space is an issue at all. I think it's about knowledge, and it's about applying that knowledge, and it's about seeing the opportunities in everything that happens, and making sure that they are done in a warm, caring way, loving way, reciprocal way, and also that they utilize language as effectively as possible. But I don't think space necessarily is an issue or a constraint in any way.
Fantastic. There's a question that's come up that looks very tactical, and perhaps I'll let Rishu take this one. It looks, so basically it says, this looks like it will take a lot of time, and I'm quite busy at work anyway. Do you have any suggestions to overcome this challenge of time constraint?
So I don't think it takes a lot of time, Saram, because it's all about understanding the basics. So once you've understood the basics, it's just about application, and you could be as creative as you want to make the best out of it. So when we're talking about the activities, you definitely have to keep your child engaged. I mean, I don't know how most kids are, but Kiara she is not going to sit for even 2 seconds, right? I mean, she just constantly wants to do something or the other, and I will run out of ideas, which is where I started getting her involved in day-to-day chores. So it's kind of a help for me, like, when we have to do gardening, I just get her to pluck the grass. So things like that doesn't take time, but at the same time, it's just a helping hand. So I think time wouldn't be a constraint.
Yeah, and the other thing that you mentioned perhaps earlier in the conversation is reaching out to corporates for help. Do you know of, is that just a notional concept, or do you know of corporates who are helping new and prospective parents with things like these?
Yes, so there are corporates, especially in the UK, where you have a lot of communities that are formed for new parents. I'm not too aware of something like that in India. So, you definitely have WhatsApp groups, but what's happening in the UK is there's a community within workplace, which is going to be for new parents. There's a lot of conferences and webinars that are being done on a time-on-time basis, just to bring them up to speed in terms of what are the challenges and how they could potentially address those. So yes, things like that are being done by the corporates in the UK, and I'm certain that it is being done in India as well.
Right. One more question that is coming up is this the only webinar that you're going to do, or would there be any future events on similar topics around parenting and early years and children, etc.? So it's a question for both of you, Jan and Rishu.
Yeah, shall I go?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, you go first.
Just go back a little, half a second. In terms of the time it takes. Again, the materials were written to be very accessible and very bite-sized. So it's about watching something for a couple of minutes and then applying that to your thinking and your interaction with the child. So it was written very much with busy parents in mind. I think this, if people want this, I think this would be a great opportunity to talk about very specific things. And actually, we touched on children with special educational needs and disabilities earlier. That might be a topic of debate or discussion, or whether there are other particular elements that people would like a focus on. Certainly, I think would be more than delighted to carry on with that and to do that. Rishu, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add there on what Jan just said, Sairam.
Okay, brilliant. So I think that's kind of covering most of the questions that have come up. So it looks like we are finishing about 5.5 minutes earlier, which is always good, because then people can go and grab a cup of water or coffee or tea or whatever works. And any final thoughts? Yeah, any final
Sairam, there
thoughts? I
are
was going to
some
say, yeah.
questions that are coming up in the Q&A
Okay.
session as well. So maybe we could just pick, since we have got about 6 minutes, could
Is
pick
that
up.
in the chat? Is that in the chat section?
No, it's in the Q&A.
Okay.
You should be able to see that. So if you don't mind, Jan, this is for you. I could read the question.
Okay.
Yeah, so the activities for children in the age group of 2.5 to 6 years are based on certain therapies. If not, how do you manage tendencies of stubbornness which is very common in kids?
In the materials we talk about what I would describe as behavior management. So how to engage children, how to work with them, how to sustain that interest. But also, again, and I talked a little bit before about the sort of instinctive nature of things. One of the things I would hope we would never do is force children to do things because we think it would be good for them as you know, in those contexts. If there's no enjoyment there, it becomes quite a shallow thing that a child wouldn't necessarily want to repeat or want to engage in. So it's about using your judgment. It's about assessing what's a good time to do particular activities. It's also about knowing your child. And Rishu, you know, you said your child is always on the go. Some children are like that. My son, who's now 25, he was when he was a very young child, he just moved constantly. He did crawl, and he crawled and moved constantly, and it was really exhausting. And actually trying to shape that and guide that took quite a lot of thinking and quite a lot of working around that. So we start with the nature of that child, and all children are different and have different propensities and different interests and different ways of doing things. But certainly within the materials, we talk about how you make that beneficial for the child. Incidentally, just as a footnote, when my son became a teenager, I don't know where all that energy went, but that's for another story.
Right, so there's one other, I think, which we can take that's come from someone who's asking, you know, we spoke about multiple languages, but they've also heard that if there are too many languages that are being spoken to a child, the child tends to get confused.
And that's very interesting. I mean, it obviously depends on the context. We certainly know that there are children growing up in some families who are speaking 3 languages simultaneously. Because of the nature and what we sometimes describe as the plasticity of the brain in the early years, the birth to 7, children are much more able to absorb and make sense of that than perhaps as children get older and go into adulthood. So again, I would first of all say you make a judgment as a parent whether that child is getting confused or not. Research tells us they're not getting confused. Research tells us actually the more languages they hear, the more they're likely to retain, process, and acquire and be able to speak them. But I'm talking very specifically about early years. I think if you bombard older children with lots and lots of different languages, that might be more problematic. But certainly in this very young age, they are much more able to adapt around that.
Thanks, and I think there are a lot of other questions, Aaron, which we'll probably not be able to cover. But
yeah, but I think we can have you, Rishu, and Jan perhaps look at them and email responses to them if possible. That's it then. You know, thank you so much to Rishu and Jan, and you've been wonderful guests. You've given us a great amount of insight, and this is kind of finally the end of the webinar. To all the participants, I want to say that you will be receiving an email containing a link to this particular webinar, but perhaps also a link to the qualification. Rishu, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So a link to the qualification that Jan mentioned. And you can watch the webinar again or share it with someone who you think might be interested in it. Thank you for your attention, and look forward to seeing all of you soon. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank
you.